This was me 5 months ago. This was me 2 days later. This was me 3 months ago. And, well, this is me now. To give you some context, 5 months ago, my family and I went on a skiing trip. I've been skiing since I was 6 years old, and so, naturally, I assumed this trip would be no different to the others. Except it wasn't. It was shorter. On day 2, I lost control of my skis on dangerous terrain and was hurtled halfway down the mountain. I was then carried down by ski patrol and taken to the nearest hospital, where I was then told that I had torn my ACL, meniscus, fractured my tibia and thumb, and had partially torn my MCL and LCL. At first, I wasn't upset or annoyed at all. That came later. I was simply naive. Initially, I had no idea how difficult, how long the recovery process would be, that I would have to miss school for physio, that I wouldn't be able to take public transport, put my own shoes on, or even take a shower. In fact, I realized that I knew nothing about ACL injuries. And I started to wonder, why did no one warn me? Why wasn't I told that this could happen? Today, we're going to question 3 central issues around ACL injuries. How can we start rethinking ACL research? Why do we only train for performance and not prevention? And is recovery more science or story? Now, some of you might be thinking, this doesn't apply to me. I barely make it up a flight of stairs and haven't played sports since school. Well, it does, because ACL injuries don't only occur in athletes. ACL injuries can happen to anyone, anytime. Now, some people are certainly more susceptible to ACL injuries than others, but we'll get onto that later. So don't zone out, because I am certainly no athlete, and I was just on a ski holiday. I conducted a survey here at Francis Holland where I asked students in year 12 what they thought an ACL was. And turns out, only 20% of students got it right. The ACL is the anterior cruciate ligament, i.e. a ligament in your knee. Now, I didn't just pick our age group because they were the easiest for me to reach and badgered to complete my survey, but rather because our age group has one of the highest ACL incidence rates globally. As well as this, teens are 29 times more likely to have ACL surgery today versus 20 years ago. And I found it worrying that only 20% of us knew what an ACL was, let alone the impact it could have. Women are 3 to 6 times more likely to rupture their ACL than men. Most would argue that this is probably related to the menstrual cycle. People love to blame the fluctuation in female hormones. Even when the Australian Rules Football League noticed their players were experiencing high ACL injury rates, their default response was to only investigate its association with the menstrual cycle. Now, I don't want to disregard the fluctuation in female hormones and what that might have on ACL incidence rates and ligament laxity, but I'd argue that reducing women's injury risks to biological factors only causes us to disregard the root cause of ACL injuries, which is likely to be strongly influenced by gendered environmental disparities. For example, we can categorize the risk factors for ACL injuries into 2 groups, intrinsic and extrinsic. Typical intrinsic and sex-based biological factors include anatomy, hormones, and genetics, while extrinsic factors include weather conditions and playing surfaces. What I have noticed is that the majority of ACL literature focuses on these intrinsic factors, with minimal recognition towards external, environmental, or social factors, despite how closely linked they are. For example, muscular strength is an intrinsic factor, which impacts ACL incidence rates. Labeling it as intrinsic suggests it's unaffected by any external factors or social factors, which simply isn't the case, as environments like the gym and prevention training programs are still heavily gendered in ways that discourage and disadvantage female participation. We must question how gender norms about girls' body, participation in sports, and funding influence girls' attitudes towards sports, body movements, and attitudes towards prevention training, and how this impacts injury risk. Moving on to prevention versus performance. Studies show that when women participated in dedicated prevention training, they experienced a significant 67% decrease in non-contact ACL injuries. The issue here is that despite how effective these prevention training programs clearly proved to be, they still suffered from low levels of commitment once this structure and supervision disappeared, which I believe is unfortunately due to the misconception that stretching and warming up is time-consuming and requires a lot of commitment. Similarly, in schools, for example, at a recreational level, prevention training might include stretching or warming up before a PE lesson. We've all done it, but the question is, do we know why we do it? Do we know why it's so important? And would we implement this practice into our lives beyond school? Power Up to Play is an exceptional charity that showcases not only the importance of warming up, but why we do it, and are at the forefront of knee injury prevention training programs in adolescents specifically. For example, feel free to join in. I know you've been sitting for a while, but don't worry, I won't be offended if you don't. This stretch, although it looks silly, is strengthening important muscles and reinforcing strong body positions. And I know that despite this presentation, you might still think that stretching and warming up is still tedious, but I promise you that it is worth it. And if there is one thing that I could have changed about that day 5 months ago, it would have been to just take 5, 10 minutes to warm up to prevent a year of recovery and a lifetime of worrying about early onset osteoarthritis. To conduct effective prevention training and reduce ACL injury rates, we need to consider that both biological and social factors are at play. As I previously mentioned, strength training is another form of prevention training. The issue here is that women still participate in strength training at a much lower rate than men, which is unfortunately due to the gender norms about how a woman's body is supposed to look and the stereotype that weightlifting is for men. To conduct effective prevention training, as I said, we need to begin conducting a more holistic approach and tackle the gender norms baked into women's sports. Now let's talk about my recovery. Despite the fact I'm only 5 months into a 12-month recovery program, I think I've learned a lot. And I think I've developed a lot as a person in ways I didn't think I would. To give you a very surface-level example, I have become very oddly appreciative of the small things, like being able to walk quickly if you're running late somewhere. As they say, recovery is all about finding the positives, which are definitely hard to find at first, but they do exist. For example, I didn't have to get on the tube at rush hour every morning for 4 months. I'm cycling now, and in a couple months, I'll be running. So to answer my question, recovery is definitely more of a mental game than a physical game. Of course, your knee hurts and you need to do your physio, but when you start focusing more on your mentality, suddenly physio becomes a break from schoolwork and you realize that the pain is just temporary. Injuries break you down, sure, but I think injuries also rebuild you stronger and smarter. And in my case, a story to tell at TEDx. Thank you.